All right, guys, Brian here with VetteSource again today on, man, another beautiful Saturday here. Can't believe it's the latter half of November. We got like 75 degrees outside, really nice. No call for any jackets or anything of that nature today. So, you know, today I'm tinkering in the garage. I was gonna get around to my Formula 350 today, but kind of got sidetracked with Thor over here. This is my affectionately what I call this car, and was thinking about some of the other videos I'd done regarding the engines, detailing that I'd done of some of the GM and Chevrolet Corvette engines that I'd done. And if you haven't seen those before, there's a playlist I've got up there at the top. You can click that link and see some of those that I've done. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about my favorite engine. Of course, this is again something that I can reflect back on as a kid, child of the 70s, and remember these, and how cool these were. And these were really the start of the horsepower wars back in the 60s. So what you're looking at here, if you're not aware of these or not familiar with this motor, this is the motor that was the answer, or the, I would say, the king of the hill, one of the king of the hills, as far as the horsepower wars that began in the 60s. Now, back then, before you had computers and turbos and superchargers and blown this and, you know, nitrous that, the answer for horsepower and torque from the manufacturers was just straight up displacement. Okay, and again, hot rodders, even now, serious racers will discuss the fact there's still no replacement for displacement, basically. And again, what that comes down to is the more bigger it is, the more power it's going to produce. Now, all three of the manufacturers, Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler, all had really good engines. You've got the 426 Hemis that came out. You've got the 428s, the side roller 427 Fords, the 428s, the 429s. Chevrolet, their answer was in 66. We took the 396 that debuted in the 65 Corvettes, and then we basically bumped it up to 427 cubic inches. And what we did was we kept the stroke the same on the crankshaft, and we just increased the bore size from 3.76 to 4.0, if I'm remembering correctly. I think that's right. I think I'm saying that right. I'm going on my book in front of me. But anyway, so what that created was the Chevrolet 427, which, of all the monikers, you know, you've got the Ford 427, the Ford 428, the Ford 429, the Hemi 426. 427 just rolls off the tongue, you know, as far as big blocks go. So this was the answer to higher horsepower back in the day. And what this consisted of was, of course, if you've looked at motors and checked them out, you know, obviously this motor physically looks a lot bigger. Now, you don't see it as much with it in the car. This is another big block sitting right here. This is a 454 out of the 72 Corvette that I'm going to be restoring shortly. And that's the size of that motor. That's how big that motor is when it's out of the car. In the car, it really doesn't look quite as big. You can't appreciate it. So this is a totally different motor than a small block. Of course, dimensions are different. And this 427 here that I'm looking at here, this is our 67 Corvette with the 427 435 horsepower engine, okay? So in 67, there were no fewer than 5 different horsepower ratings options on the 427s there. You had the 390 horsepower, which is in the Daytona Yellow Corvette that you guys have seen me work on a couple times. You also had the L, and that's the L36. You had the L68, which is essentially the L36 engine internals with the tri-power carburetor, which I'll explain more about in a minute. And then you had the L71, which is the bad boy, the wicked bad boy of all of them, and that was the internal, basically, motor, the same motor as an L72 427 that was in the 66 Corvette, with the same internals, but with a tri-power carburetor setup like this one has, this 3x2. So what they did basically with these motors was, from the bottom up, you've got a forged steel crank sitting in 4-bolt main block with heavy-duty rods, of course, heavy-duty pistons. You've got 11:1 compression ratio. You have square port heads on these motors, right? You've got solid lift camshaft with, for God's sakes, if you guys know can specs, some of you, this may not mean anything to you, but 306 degrees duration with around a 540 lift cam, which was insane, right? With, I think, a lobe separation angle of around 112 degrees. Sitting on top of it was an intake system with 3 carburetors, right? So of these L71s, which is what this motor is, and this was one of the 5 motors available. You had the L88s and the L89s, but they're so rare that I didn't spend a lot of time talking about them. I'll probably save that for another video. But of the L71s, this L71 was produced for 3 years, from 67 to 69. And they made right around 9,300 of these motors total. So there's not a whole lot of them out there that were made new. And even now, you'll see them mostly kept off the streets as collector items. And they're not really driven terribly a whole lot. Let me see if I can get my camera to hold up while I take this air cleaner off, so you guys can see. So like I said, this was a motor that from the beginning, when it was first produced, was an extremely special motor. This was not something that everybody ordered, because it's not entirely drivable as a daily driver. It's more of a beast, really. Hang on just a second, it doesn't want to stick. There we go. So with this solid lift cam, high revving, this motor's rated at 435 horsepower at 5,600 RPM, puts out around in the neighborhood close to 500 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, so but with the solid lift camshaft, the high compression pistons, this is not, even by today's standards, a car that you go get groceries in. Okay, I've also detailed before in another video, this is a motor that did not come with any power feature options. You could get power brakes, I think I'm remembering that correctly, but as far as power features here, I'm sorry, you could get power steering. I don't think you could get power brakes on the 67 435 cores, but you could not get air conditioning, because all they would do was throw the belts. I'm pretty sure you get power brakes, but not the air conditioning. So these were monsters from the beginning. Everybody knew that, and of course they usually were well maintained, or at least tried to be protected, kind of like what the new Z06s, not the new Z06, but the C7, the C6 Z06s. So the thing that was unique about this motor was the fact that it had these 3 carburetors. Now GM's official name, and Pontiac started using it back in the earlier 60s, was a tri-power, and Chevrolet adapted this for the Big Block. So what you've got here are 3 individual Holley carburetors, and in fact I'm pretty sure, I think Ford did use it. I know for sure that Mopar used it with a 6-pack nomenclature. So you've got 3 carburetors here, 3 2-barrel carburetors with a progressive linkage. Okay, the engine operates primarily off this center carburetor. These 1 and 3 are not driven by a mechanical idle circuit. So what you'll see here is, as I pull that back, you'll see that accelerator pump on number 2 will come open, but 1 and 3 do not open. You can kind of see that progressive linkage right there that controls that, right? What happens though is 1 and 3 have these very unique vacuum pods on them, right? So what it does is, as you lay into the throttle on this, it's got a smooth transition, if it's working correctly, of the vacuum pod slowly opening your accelerator. Let me see if I can show you on this side. Okay, as I was saying before, the GoPro again decided to quit working for me. As much as I like a lot of features of this GoPro, there's a lot of things I don't like that it just randomly cuts out. So anyway, as I was saying before I got rudely cut off here, was that this progressive linkage on our 1 and 3 basically works as such. So you've got a wide open throttle, right? Let's say you're getting into it, you're rowing through the gears, and as you're rowing through those gears, what's going to happen is the butterflies will begin to open progressively on these 2 1 and 3 carburetors to feed it with more fuel. Hang on, let me see if I can get this done right so you can see. There we go. And you see those are full open position, right? Those are their full stop. Now if I leave those there and then I close the main throttle, it'll actually push back everything back to closed state again. You'll notice there's no accelerator pump for you old guys like me. There's no accelerator pump on the 1 and 3 carburetors. These are basically just dummy, not dummy, but just basically fuel feed type carburetors. Number 2 is the only one that's going to have a accelerator pump. The other thing these motors came with in 67 was the first year for, maybe I may be wrong, maybe they did 66, but you've got an early version of an HEI called a transistorized ignition. So they actually received an electronic ignition, and just for trivia's sake, this braiding, this steel braiding on these wires is not there just for looks. It's actually to keep the radio, or the signal, the magnetic signal from the distributor from interfering with the radio signal. And you can see up here in the front, there's the module. The module was actually kept up front here, separate from the rest of it. So that's a TI module is what they call that. So, you know, again, this, and not knocking any of the other manufacturers, they all came up with cubic inches was their answer for the horsepower wars back then. These motors are not like driving anything else, even of today's vintage, okay? You know, the power that they're able to produce nowadays with computers and power adders is great, but there is something very distinctive about driving a big block of anything, any vintage, Chevrolet, Ford, or Mopar, Dodge, Chrysler, of that vintage. It's an experience that if you're a gearhead, you really remember what you did, what you experienced. The other thing about these too is that these are not creature comfort type motors. These are monsters. So, you know, you're gonna smell like gas most of the time when you get out of it. The cars actually generate, this motor generates a lot of heat, so you're gonna feel that heat inside the compartment. In fact, like I said, you couldn't even get these with air conditioning. So there's a lot of things, you know, the solid lift cams on these are adjusting the cams. The valve covers come off every 3,000 miles or so, or less, just to keep the cam lash in specs. Oil has to be changed frequently. This actually still has its original oil filter canister. I don't think you can see it from here. This is a pretty down-to-earth original type car. It hasn't been restored, other than that center carburetor I had to have done a few years back. So these are amazing, hands down, and the sound of these is like nothing else. The one thing I find disappointing to me about the newer cars is that they're just too raspy. The exhaust note's not very deep. This thing hits. When you hear this down the street, you know a big block's coming down the street. If you've listened to these before, you know what's underneath the hood. So it's a really unique thing. And again, if you're going to car shows, you're looking at cars, the one major identifier, at least for Chevrolets, now Buicks, Oldsmobiles are harder to tell because externally they always kind of all look the same. But on a Chevrolet, if it's got this big monstrous valve cover, especially with this dent in the back corner, they actually did that for power brake booster clearance, but a lot of them, like I said, didn't come with that. But if you see this big honking thing here, and if you see a tri-power on it, you know darn good and well you're looking at a Chevy Big Block, if it's under the hood of a Chevy, obviously. But distributor will always be in the back. But anyway, I just thought I'd continue on with this series. I see you guys have been enjoying some of the engine detailing series I've been doing. I've been liking actually talking about them, because this is what I'm passionate about, is these old engines and stuff like that. I'd also like to thank all the new subscribers I've received over the last few weeks. I really appreciate that. The enthusiasm and comments I got back on the LT4 videos was really great. If you haven't seen those before, there's a link up there at the top of the video for those. But I think that's all I'm going to do it for now. I'm actually think I'm going to go take a cruise in one of the Corvettes. I might go ahead and take old Orange Flame out for a little while, because he's running really good and it's perfect weather for him. So I'll check back with you guys next week. Everybody, if you're in the States here, have a great Thanksgiving or holidays with your family. Hopefully it's all stress-free. Hope you will get to be with your family for the holidays, and we'll check back in next time, guys. Talk to you then.